Hey, so today I'm angry at the banks, and hopefully I'll be able to explain why to you in a few short paragraphs. As always, I'd like to ask you if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Let's start with our current circumstance. How have the banks acted in this COVID-19 emergency that we're, quote, all in together, end quote? Well, first of all, they've been allowed to charge, I've heard credible estimates of $10 billion in fees for arranging these loans that the federal government has guaranteed. The bank has no risk at all in these loans. They just collect a fee. 10 billion. What's that about fees, you ask? How about this? 2019, banks, the big banks, the biggest banks, only collected $34 billion in fees. Talk about being feed to death. That doesn't even count the fees that they charged the people who deposited the bad checks. That was just the fee charged to the people who wrote the bad checks. If you've ever deposited a check that somebody else has given you that's bad, you know there's a fee that you have to pay as well. That's not even included. Bank fees are out of control, but that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that banks look at their deposit base and they see money that they want to be able to gamble with. And in the 1920s, they did so to such a tremendous extent that after the crash of 29, the banks were reined in. The act of Congress called Glass-Steagall limited banks to only doing banking. They couldn't do investment banking. They couldn't do trading on their own account. And for many years, everything was fine. But then in 1987, the Federal Reserve found a loophole in this law, and they allowed Citibank to buy Smith Barney, one of the biggest banks, buying one of the biggest brokerage firms. In 1987, it was allowed. Citibank was able to buy Smith Barney. And shortly thereafter, surprise, surprise, it was ruled that because Glass-Steagall was no longer valid since Citibank and Smith Barney had combined, that all restrictions were off. And they succeeded. The Graham-Leach-Bliley Act passed in 1999. It repealed the part of the Glass-Steagall Act that controlled what commercial banks were able to do and basically allowed them to do anything they wished: insurance, investment banking, trading, and also banking. Now, here's the big problem. You may say it's a company. What right do we have to restrict what they do? The reason we have a right to restrict what they do is we are guaranteeing them, you and me, the taxpayer. We are the ones who are guaranteeing their equity. I mean, look at what happened in 2008 when the banks were caught with huge amounts of mortgage securities on their books and were basically insolvent because these securities had lost so much value. The banks were considered too big to fail. We bailed them out. What did they do right after that? They issued themselves billion-dollar bonuses as an industry with our bailout money. And of course we hooted and made a bit of a fuss about it, but nothing changed. Nothing ever happened with that money. It was never repaid. The banks are not our friends. They are not representing us. They should be treated like a utility. Banks should perform banking. Here's another amusing and almost unbelievable fact. Depositors in a failed bank, they are considered creditors. It's not your money once you deposit in the bank. You think you're giving the bank a deposit and it's still yours? No, you're now a creditor of the bank only, and actually an unsecured creditor besides. So let's talk about what the essence of the problem is. You have these entities that have become essential to our daily lives because they are in between almost every transaction. When you write a check, when you pay with a bank card or a debit card, wire money, all requiring a bank today. Now tomorrow, maybe it's different with Bitcoin and other non-centralized financial services, but today the banks rule. And not only do they rule, but they've learned that if you can get big, really big, huge, you can be deemed too big to fail. And what that means is whatever gambling, investments, trading you do, if you lose your butt and you are bankrupt, you will be bailed out. You will be bailed out. You're too big to fail. The banks have protections that the rest of us don't have. And the fact is that the banks have shown no gratitude at all. We bailed them out in 2008. They were bankrupt, kaput. There was no liquidity. They couldn't sell the bonds that they had, and there was no market. We bailed them out. They repaid us by paying themselves bonuses, and Look at what they've done recently with this COVID-19 crisis. Not only have they charged a ridiculous amount of fees to pass government money through to us, but they've actually tightened lending standards. I mean, I think it was Wells Fargo that said they're not going to do any home loans with a credit score of less than 700. Tightening loan requirements at a time like this? I mean, what happened to all of us in this together? The banks are a hostile agency against us. They look at us as sheep to be shorn and sometimes, killed just to make an example for the rest of us. Look at what happened in '08 when the banks found themselves with title that had been compromised because of their central clearing agency. They filed false reports in court. They had people representing that they were signing who had seen documentation that didn't exist. Fraud took place. No one ever investigated it. No one ever prosecuted it. The banks are one of the protected oligarchies here in this country. Let's take a look at what they're doing. It used to be illegal to charge more than 12% for a credit card. And what do we have today? Rates of 25%, 30%. While the banks are borrowing money at 0.1, borrowing money from us, the taxpayer. They turn around and lend it to us at 25%. My God, how egregious does it have to be? It's totally in our faces. The banks are extracting whatever they can from us. They are a predatory class. There should never be a bank too big to fail. A bank just takes in deposits and makes loans. Why would we ever allow them to get too big to fail? Why would we ever allow them to gamble? I'll remind you that when banks gamble, the winnings go to the bank and the losses, you got it. We make those good. The taxpayer, again, on the hook, again. And we don't even get gratitude. We get nothing. Just get a chance to pay more fees. Please, look at the banking industry. There's so much that can be done to improve it. Let's separate banking from investment banking so that banking is a public service as it should be. Let them gamble with their own money. Please, look around and wake up.